My daughter-in-law smashed the wheels of my chair and told me to stay put, unless I signed away 900 acres and the old house where I raised my children. My own son stood silent, letting her speak. The humiliation burned deeper than the scars I carried from war. They thought I was helpless, ready to hand them everything, even the savings I had hidden for decades. I held my breath, steady and cold. What they never imagined was that those $11 million would become my sharpest weapon. What followed tore apart more than a family. After she crushed the wheels of my chair, I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I just sat there in the silence of my own porch while the gravel crunched beneath her boots as she walked back inside. The screen door slammed like punctuation. My son stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same blank stare he'd mastered over the years. Not a word to me, not even a glance. The chair wasn't the point. That was just a message. Darla could have taken the paperwork and handed it to me like a civil person, but she needed it to sting. That's the thing with women like her. They don't come at you with a knife. They come with a smile, followed by a push off the ledge. It wasn't just the ranch. That was the headline, sure. 900 acres, fenced, working, debt-free. Prime Wyoming land that had been in my late husband's family for 4 generations. But what they really wanted, what they always wanted, was the house. The original stone house. The one with the wood-burning stove and the iron weather vane my father-in-law hammered by hand during the war. They wanted it all wrapped up in their names before winter. Darla had already started changing things before that morning. She moved family photos into storage, hired a contractor to assess the value of the East Wing, sent out property tax inquiries under her own name. She didn't think I noticed. Or maybe she didn't care. Marcus? He followed. That's what he's good at. Following strong women who told him what to think and when to speak. First me, then her. And when she turned her aim toward my legacy, he just stepped aside. I looked down at my hands that morning. They weren't shaking. That surprised me. After all these years, I thought betrayal would send a wave of heat, of helplessness. But I didn't feel helpless. I felt cold, clear. The kind of clear you only get after surviving things meant to break you. There were papers waiting on the kitchen table. A thick folder marked transfer of interest. Not just for the land. Inside it was language about trust dissolution, control of investment accounts, even access to the mineral rights my late husband had sealed up tight 20 years ago. I hadn't told them about the savings, the offshore holding, or the mineral royalties I'd tucked away under my name only. I kept those things quiet. Not out of secrecy. Out of survival. If you've lived long enough to be betrayed by your own blood, you know what I mean. You know there are lines they cross long before they ever raise their voice. The first time your grown child corrects you in front of a bank manager. The moment they start calling your bedroom the guest room. The way they talk about you like a liability, not a person. So no, I wasn't surprised by the paperwork. I wasn't even surprised when she whispered through her teeth, "If you don't sign, you can just stay on that porch until the snow takes you." What did surprise me, what made my stomach twist in a new, unfamiliar way, was that Emily saw it all. My granddaughter stood behind the living room curtain, her little hand pressing against the glass. She didn't cry. She didn't run to me. She just watched. Quiet. Frozen. That's what broke something in me. Not the chair, not Darla's words, but the way that child watched cruelty happen like it was normal. I didn't say a word when Marcus finally stepped out and asked if I needed help back inside. I just looked at him, really looked. At the lines forming near his eyes, the nervous twitch in his left hand, the way he wouldn't meet my gaze. I used to hold that hand when he was 5 and scared of lightning. Now he couldn't even face me after letting his wife take a hammer to my only means of movement. I wheeled myself, what was left of the frame, around the side path, dragging it through the gravel inch by inch. My back ached, my hands burned. But I got there, because I had something they didn't know about, something they would never understand. Not just $11 million sitting in accounts with names they'd never seen, not just documents they'd never find. What I had was time, and patience, and fire. They thought they were cornering an old woman in a broken chair. What they did was wake a soldier who'd survived war, grief, and silence, and now silence was no longer on the menu. You ever been pushed too far by the people you carried on your back your whole life? If so, you already know what happens next. And if you don't, well, keep listening. I didn't wait until morning. By the time the porch light flickered off and the shadows stretched long across the driveway, I had already pulled myself back into the house. Every movement, slow but deliberate. I didn't call for help. I didn't knock on the wall like they expected. I used the side railing and my arms, and I dragged myself across the floor. Not out of pride, out of principle. Once inside, I locked the front door. Then I slid the bolt shut. I moved past the kitchen, past the pile of folded paperwork they'd left waiting for me, and went straight to the room nobody else ever entered. My husband used to call it the bunker. To them, it was just a dusty office with tax folders and old service plaques on the wall. But they never knew what I kept behind the panel. I pulled the floor mat back, felt for the soft hollow in the wood, then opened the recessed compartment. It groaned softly like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside was the steel box. My hands didn't tremble when I opened it. If anything, they steadied. I laid the contents out in 3 rows on the desk. Birth certificates, original land deeds, stock holdings. The letter from our mineral appraiser estimating the untapped value under the northwest field. And deeper still, the 2 documents that mattered more than all the rest. The military insurance bond that had rolled over every year since 1989, and the inheritance from my uncle's estate that I'd placed under a quiet financial shell 2 counties over. That inheritance was the root of the savings Marcus never knew existed. $11 million, accumulated through time, interest, and staying silent when it counted. It wasn't just a cushion. It was a firewall. One they couldn't burn through. I placed the folder labeled Whitfield Conservation Trust on the far right corner. I'd drafted it 5 years ago after Darla's first attempt to pitch a housing development scheme to Marcus. She thought I hadn't heard that call. I had. I'd heard every word through the thin living room wall. That night I sat up until dawn and started planning. Quietly, thoroughly. What they saw in me was old age. What I saw in them was strategy. And I knew how to beat strategy. At 2:45 a.m. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The house was dead quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge and the floorboards adjusting with the cold. I sipped slowly, eyes scanning the layout of the plan one more time. I wasn't rushing. Rushing was for the panicked. I was calm, measured, intentional. By 3:30, I had redrawn the chain of title for the ranch in my ledger, just to double-check every name. The land was in my name, entirely. There were no co-signers, no trustees, no small print they could manipulate. I had never remarried, never added Marcus, never added anyone. And I kept every receipt, every boundary report, every zoning update. I didn't do it because I was suspicious. I did it because I was trained to plan for ambushes. This was one of them. At 4:10, I wheeled into the hallway and stared at the family photos still hanging by the stairs. I didn't cry. I had done enough of that over the years. I had cried when James died. I had cried when Marcus stopped calling on birthdays. But tonight, no tears. Only clarity. They had made their move. I was making mine. At 4:27, I called Colonel Arthur Maddox. He picked up by the 3rd ring. He never was one to sleep past dawn. I said my name, and he paused for half a second before answering like he always did when we served together. What do you need? Not how are you, not what's going on, just that. Because people like us didn't waste time on fluff. I told him I needed two things. One, a direct contact for the land use attorney he mentioned last Thanksgiving. Two, a referral for an estate strategist who didn't flinch at family pressure. He gave me both without hesitation. I thanked him. We didn't exchange pleasantries. We didn't linger. By 5:00, I had 3 appointments on my calendar, all virtual, all under my name. None connected to the house Wi-Fi. I had activated my own mobile hotspot and started encrypting all outgoing emails through a secure client I'd paid for years ago and never had to use. Until now. I backed up every file onto a drive and placed it in the bottom of a potted plant in the sunroom. Just in case. There was always a just in case. By 6:12, the sun was starting to rise. I sat at the kitchen table, the broken wheel of my old chair still leaning against the counter. I stared at it, let it sit there like a broken bone that no one thought would be noticed. Like a message they assumed I was too old to read. But I read it, and I had answered. Not with words. With war. By mid-morning, I had the folders stacked, labelled, and sealed. Each one held something specific. One for property, one for financials, one for contingencies. The trust documents were in the red folder, thick and heavy. I didn't rush the process. I worked methodically like I was taught. Sort, check, double check. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. I had no intention of being caught flat-footed. I didn't hear from them that morning. No knocks on the door. No phone calls. The silence from Marcus and Darla didn't surprise me. It confirmed everything I already knew. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to check in. They were waiting for me to cool off, for me to crawl back and ask for help with my chair, my meds, or maybe just a ride into town. That was their pattern. Hurt, wait, then re-enter once the dust settled. But this time I wasn't sitting in the dust. I was setting the fuse. At 9:00 sharp, I logged into the video call with the estate strategist. Her name was Ramona Dyer, a short, direct woman based out of Cheyenne. She wore a grey blazer and glasses that magnified her gaze just enough to make most people nervous. I liked her immediately. She didn't flinch when I told her about the attempted signature grab. She didn't blink when I mentioned the broken wheelchair. She just listened, scribbled notes, and asked the right questions. When I told her I had already formed the structure of the Conservation Trust, she nodded once and said, "Good." Then she asked if I wanted it insulated against challenge. I said yes. She told me it would take 3 days. I told her she had 2. After the call, I didn't sit still. I moved to the back office and opened the cabinet where I kept the family photo albums. I pulled out the oldest one, the one with the leather spine and the hand-tied binding James had made after his first deployment. I flipped through page after page of faces, young and bright. I paused on one in particular, Marcus at 10, holding a ribbon he'd won for a junior rodeo. That was before the edges hardened in him, before he learned how to disappear behind silence. I closed the album and returned it to the shelf. That part of my life didn't need to be reopened. Not now. By noon, I was dressed and waiting by the window. Clara May Jensen, my neighbor across the field, had agreed to stop by with her truck. She was one of the few people who never asked too many questions. She'd seen enough over the years to understand that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. She pulled up at 12:30, right on time. I wheeled myself out, locked the front door behind me, and climbed into the passenger seat with her help. Neither of us said much on the drive. We stopped first at the county records office. I had called ahead and asked for a private room. When the clerk saw me coming, She gave a small, stiff nod. I didn't care for her attitude, but I wasn't there to win favours. I was there to file the amended deed updates that transferred the property title from my personal name into the trust, with full conservation protections. The woman handed me the stamped forms, looked at me over the edge of her glasses, and said, "Everything's official now." That was all I needed to hear. Back in the truck, Clara May asked if I needed anything else in town. I told her yes. I asked her to take me to Pastor Cole's office. I knew what I was doing. When we arrived, he was seated on the front steps of the church with a Bible resting on his knee. He stood when he saw me, adjusted his collar, and greeted me with a quiet, familiar tone. We'd never been particularly close, but there was history between us. He'd baptized Emily. He'd presided over James's memorial. And he'd seen enough to know when something serious was stirring. We sat in his office, low-ceilinged and warm with old wood. I laid the documents on his desk. Not to get approval, not even for legal protection. But because I wanted him to know. I wanted the moral witness. The town didn't always move on paper. Sometimes it moved on whispers, on who stood where when the storm started. I told him what happened. I didn't dramatize it. I gave him the facts. He listened. He nodded. And when I finished, he looked at me and said that if I needed a public forum, the church was available. That was all. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I just looked him in the eye and said thank you. Back at the ranch, the house sat quiet. Too quiet. The air was still. The curtains barely moved. It was the kind of stillness that meant something was coming. I rolled into the kitchen and placed the stamped forms next to the ledger. I'd already scanned and backed up the copies. Redundancy again. Then I went to the barn. The old work table was still there. Dusty, yes, but solid. I sat beside it and opened the smaller safe tucked beneath the floorboards. Inside was the original mineral rights file, sealed, notarized, and untouched since 2002. Marcus didn't know it existed. Darla certainly didn't. That file proved that a portion of the Northwest Ridge still carried value far beyond surface land. I wasn't planning to sell it. I wasn't planning to extract a cent. But I wanted it there. A card they didn't even know I held. At sunset, I watched the light stretch across the back field, long and gold. The fence line shimmered, and the air smelled of dry pine and soil. The land didn't know it had nearly been stolen. But I did. And I was far from finished. What I had done that day wasn't the strike, it was the weight shift. The moment you lean back, watch them move in, and prepare to cut clean across their plans. Tomorrow, I would draw blood, quietly, cleanly, and publicly. The morning of the town hall meeting, I got up early and took my time. I didn't rush. I didn't scramble. I moved with the kind of clarity that comes when the nerves are gone, and all that's left is execution. I had already fought the private war. Now it was time to bring it into the open. The meeting was scheduled for 10. It wasn't about me, officially. It was supposed to be about zoning updates and local infrastructure repairs. But everyone knew it was more than that. People had heard things, whispers at the feed store, glances exchanged at Sunday service. When small towns sense blood in the water, they show up. I dressed in the charcoal jacket James used to say made me look unbreakable. The silver star pin rested just beneath the collar. No medals, no grand displays. Just enough to remind people of who I was before they tried to make me disappear. Clara May picked me up again. Same truck, same silence. We didn't talk on the ride in. We didn't need to. She saw the folders in my lap and knew what they meant. She parked along the west side of the community center and helped me inside. The room was already half full when we arrived. I saw familiar faces, some that looked away when I caught their eyes. Others nodded, respectful, cautious. Pastor Cole stood near the front, speaking quietly with the event coordinator. I rolled to the far end of the second row, not front and center, not tucked in the back, right where people had to see me. At 9:58, Marcus and Darla walked in. He wore that same navy pullover he always used when he wanted to look composed. Darla had her hair tied back, neat and severe. They didn't look around much, just found 2 seats along the far wall, diagonally across from me. She looked down at her phone. He looked nowhere at all. The meeting began with announcements and updates, roadwork schedules, waste removal issues. People listened, nodded, murmured their approval or complaints. I waited. Calm. Still. My hands folded in my lap, the red folder resting against my leg. At exactly 10:37, Pastor Cole asked if there were any public comments unrelated to zoning. I raised my hand. He acknowledged me immediately. I wheeled forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just enough movement to be unmistakable. I turned toward the room, cleared my throat once, and laid the red folder on the lectern. What I said was short. I informed the assembly that I had submitted updated land deed documentation to the county the day prior, that all 900 acres of Red Rock Ranch had been formally transferred into the Whitfield Conservation Trust. That, effective immediately, it was no longer under personal ownership, but under protected status. I stated that no development, sale, or partitioning could take place from this point forward. Not by family. Not by developers. Not by anyone. Then I opened the folder. I didn't read the legal fine print. I didn't need to. I handed copies to Pastor Cole and the town clerk. They scanned the headers, eyes widening. Murmurs rolled through the room like wind through dry brush. Before the noise could swell further, I kept going. I informed the room that I had also filed a formal complaint with the state's Elder Protection Agency, citing coercion and attempted financial manipulation. That the complaint included video and audio evidence. That a separate complaint had been lodged regarding destruction of medical mobility equipment. That got their attention. I paused then. Let it sink in. Then I pressed the button on the small remote I'd tucked in my jacket pocket. A short clip played from the screen set up in the corner of the room. It was grainy, but clear enough. Darla's voice rang out sharp and unfiltered. If you don't sign it, then sit there and rot. The silence that followed was absolute. Pastor Cole's mouth pressed into a flat line. The clerk adjusted his glasses. 2 women in the third row leaned forward as if trying to read something in my face. I didn't flinch. I said nothing more. I closed the folder, turned my chair slowly, and returned to my place in the second row. Nobody said a word for almost a full minute. Then came the rustle of paper, the sound of movement, the quiet shifting of people realizing they had witnessed something larger than a dispute. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a reckoning. Marcus didn't look at me. Darla stared straight ahead, face tight and pale, her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white. They didn't speak. They didn't argue. They didn't try to defend themselves. And that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't need their reaction. I didn't need a show. What I had delivered wasn't for them. It was for the room, for the eyes that had looked away too many times, for the ears that had heard rumors but never asked questions, for the town that thought Joanne Whitfield had gone quiet and was fading into the background. I wasn't fading. I was solidifying. The meeting continued after that, technically. A few more announcements, a budget review. But nobody was really listening. They were still processing. The weight of what they'd just seen would hang over the room for days, maybe weeks. Clara May and I left without speaking. I didn't need to explain anything to her. She already knew. She'd known it was coming. She just didn't know when or how hard it would hit. We pulled into my driveway just past noon. I thanked her, rolled myself inside, and placed the red folder back on the desk where it belonged. Then I made one more call. This time, not to a lawyer, to Martha Green, editor, journalist, local, fair, unflinching. She picked up. I said my name. She paused, then replied, I heard. I told her I was ready to talk. The strike had landed. And now the story would spread. Martha Green arrived the next morning with 2 black coffees and a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't waste time. She never had. Her boots were still dusty from the parking lot, and her recorder was already in her hand by the time I opened the door. She stepped inside like she had been invited months ago. I led her to the kitchen, where the folder with the stamped deed copies still lay unopened since yesterday. The air in the house was still, like it had been holding its breath since the town hall. I poured her a cup of coffee and didn't ask how much she had already heard. In towns like this, you don't need to ask. The walls have ears, and they all talk. We sat across from each other at the table, the same one where Darla had once demanded I consider retirement options. The irony didn't escape me. Martha took out a yellow notepad, set her recorder down between us, and looked at me like she'd just clocked in for a shift she was born for. I started talking. I told her what had happened, in order, without theatrics. The chair, the papers, the silence. The betrayal that came in, measured glances, and avoided conversations. She didn't interrupt. She only nodded now and then, her pen moving quickly but not frantic. When I told her about the trust transfer, her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. When I mentioned the recordings, she leaned forward just enough to make her interest known. 2 hours passed like 10 minutes. She left with everything she needed. Names, dates, documents, audio clips, screenshots. She didn't ask for the dramatic quote or the perfect ending. She didn't need it. The truth, in this case, was enough. By late afternoon, the article went live. The headline was simple. Veteran ranch owner faces off against family over land grab. The subheader cut deeper. Video footage raises elder abuse. Concerns as local matriarch fights back. It didn't take long. Within the hour, calls started coming in. The first was from an old neighbor 3 roads over. The second was from a woman I hadn't spoken to since my husband's funeral. By sunset, I'd received 12 voicemails and more messages than I cared to count. Some were kind, others hesitant, but all of them knew. The silence was over. The one call I didn't get was from Marcus. Instead, it was Darla. Her number flashed across the screen, and I let it ring out. 3 minutes later, she tried again, then again. Then a text message came through, a thin strip of pleading wrapped in passive aggression. We need to talk about the article. You made things worse than they needed to be. I ignored it. By evening, Jenna Whitmore from the Town Planning Board sent an email requesting a meeting. She wanted clarification on the conservation status of the land and whether it impacted the long-term development forecast for the county. That was her way of saying, you just cut off our revenue stream, and we're not sure how to react. I replied with one sentence. All documents are now a matter of public record. The story spread beyond the county the next morning. A regional paper picked it up and ran a second piece, this one with a still image from the town hall meeting. It showed me mid-speech, hand on the folder, jaw set. I looked like someone ready to burn down a legacy just to build it back on her own terms. That afternoon, I drove to the post office. It wasn't for letters. It was to confirm a package had arrived. Inside was a hard copy of the forensic accounting audit I had ordered weeks earlier. I hadn't told anyone about it. Not even Clara May. It covered every joint filing Marcus had submitted over the last 5 years. Tax returns, grant proposals, estate projections. I had flagged specific documents I suspected he had altered. I was right. 3 line items jumped off the page. One was a property development initiative he'd pitched quietly under a shell company. Another was a shared account he'd attempted to link my name to, through forged digital signatures. The last was a housing application marked with my address, but not my consent. All small things, all deniable in isolation. But together, they formed a pattern, and patterns don't lie. That night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my estate lawyer, confirming the next round of asset locks. The second was to the sheriff's department, where I asked to speak with Deputy Linwood, a man I trusted. I didn't press charges, not yet. But I wanted documentation. I wanted them to know I was prepared. The third call was to McKenna. She didn't answer right away. But when she did, I told her everything. I told her to come back. I needed someone sharp, loyal, and already familiar with what I'd built. She was halfway through her response before I even finished the request. She arrived the next morning. Her presence changed the atmosphere in the house instantly. She moved like someone who had never forgotten military rhythm. Tight steps, quiet preparation, calm urgency. She knew how to listen and when not to speak. By lunchtime, she had set up a new document archive. By dinner, she had found 3 additional property inquiries that Marcus had made through third-party brokers. I didn't react. I only nodded. We kept moving. On the third day, Martha's article made the front page of the State Journal. That was the tipping point. Darla's sister called into a local radio show to defend her, but halfway through she accidentally confirmed that the financial documents had been altered months ago. The station pulled the clip within the hour, but it was too late. Screenshots were already making their rounds. That same day, the sheriff's office officially opened a review. Not a full investigation, but enough to draw attention. Marcus tried calling, twice, then he emailed. The subject line was one word. Please, I didn't open it. Because sometimes, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the sound of everything breaking. And this time, it wasn't me breaking apart. It was them, piece by piece, word by word. Every lie collapsing under its own weight. Every quiet betrayal finally lit up for everyone to see. I didn't need revenge. I needed truth. And now, it was speaking for itself. By the end of that week, nothing in town sounded the same. People still chatted at the diner. The bell above the pharmacy still rang when the door opened. Church service still started at 10. But the tones had shifted. Conversations paused when I entered a room. Heads turned just slightly slower. Whispers carried farther. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration either. It was awareness. I had stepped out of the shadow they tried to place me in, and now no one could unsee it. The house stayed quiet, but no longer with tension. It had the quiet of preparation, the kind that lingers right before something breaks. McKenna worked like a second heartbeat. I didn't have to ask twice. She reorganized everything from the tax files to the surveillance copies. Each folder had a backup. Each drive had a twin. She kept detailed notes of every phone call, every message, every account login. Her calm reminded me of what it felt like to have a unit again, even if it was only 2 of us. The real shift began when I received a call from my accountant, Richard Lyon. I had known him for over 20 years. He wasn't one for dramatics, which made his tone even more telling. He had received a request from the bank, flagging a large attempted transfer from one of the agricultural subsidy accounts linked to the ranch. The request was made under my name, but submitted through a portal I hadn't used in over a decade. They had tried again. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about money. They were testing access points, looking for cracks, poking at old systems to see which ones still worked. I told him to freeze every account except the 2 we'd already moved into the trust. I asked for a fraud alert to be issued to every connected branch. Richard said he would personally walk into the bank and deliver the paperwork himself. That was the benefit of working with someone who remembered a time before digital shortcuts. He understood the value of standing in front of a person with a document in hand. An hour later, I received an email from the regional title office. Someone had filed an anonymous zoning complaint against the western edge of the ranch. The reason listed was environmental risk related to drainage mismanagement. I knew that stretch of land like the back of my hand. There hadn't been drainage issues since we rebuilt the runoffs after the floods 12 years ago. It was manufactured. A move meant to stall, to open the gate for inspections and interruptions. They thought if they couldn't win clean, they'd gum up the process. I submitted counter-documentation before the afternoon ended. The scanned diagrams, the dated invoices, the permits. I didn't need to prove my memory. I just needed the paper trail to match it. That same night, I saw a post online. A local Facebook group had been flooded with old photos of me from the early 90s, taken at a protest I had joined during my last year of service. The captions were vague, the implications sharper. Words like unstable and anti-government floated in the comments. I recognized Darla's cousin's name among the commenters. They were trying to frame a narrative, paint me as unpredictable, someone who might not be fit to handle her own estate. They didn't know I had already filed a legal declaration of capacity, signed, evaluated, notarized, submitted 2 weeks earlier as a quiet counterweight to the rumors I suspected might come. I didn't wait to be cornered. I built walls while they plotted. The next morning, McKenna printed out every screenshot, every comment, every name. She didn't ask what I wanted her to do with them. She just filed them under a new tab, retaliation materials. The retaliation didn't stop there. The following day, the county clerk's office received an anonymous ethics complaint about the land trust filing. They claimed I had violated conflict of interest procedures, that somehow I had misrepresented my intentions to the community. I knew the language, I knew how it worked. It was the kind of vague accusation that made people flinch, designed to shake confidence, not prove guilt. The clerk flagged it, didn't file it officially. Instead, she called me directly and asked if I had a moment to stop by. I went that afternoon. She didn't mince words. She laid the complaint on her desk and slid it toward me. Her eyes were tired. Her voice was low. She told me off the record that she didn't believe it for a second, but it would eventually reach someone who might. She wanted me to be ahead of it. I left her office and called Joseph Maddox, my attorney. I gave him the full rundown. Within 24 hours, he filed a preemptive defense package that cited every regulation we'd followed, every timeline we'd documented. He included character statements, property history, and the full conservation contract. He didn't ask for approval before submitting. He already knew the stakes. On the fourth day, Marcus showed up at the gate. He didn't come inside. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for a bus that wouldn't arrive. He looked thinner, hollow. But I didn't move. I watched from the kitchen window and let the moment pass. He stayed for 10 minutes. Then he left. Darla didn't come, but her name did. In an internal memo leaked from her workplace, her name was listed in an audit request tied to misuse of hospital grant funds. A whistleblower had stepped forward, linking her to a redirection of money toward a private non-profit. The non-profit was run by her sister, the same sister who had tried to defend her on that radio show. The pieces were shifting faster now. It wasn't just them falling apart. It was the system they'd built. Quiet favors, fake documents, the illusion of control. And now, with every report filed, every message archived, every call documented, I watched it fracture from the inside out. Not with fireworks, not with screaming, but with silence. A different kind. The kind that breaks back. And for the first time in weeks, I sat on my front porch and listened to it without fear. The wind in the trees, the soft creak of the gate, the distant hush of a world still turning, because they had tried to erase me. But I was still here, and they were the ones disappearing. The sun barely rose that morning before the first wave hit. At exactly 7:42 a.m., McKenna called out from the den with a tone I hadn't heard from her before. It wasn't panic. It was sharpened purpose. I wheeled into the room. She had the morning news up on her laptop, volume low, eyes focused. The local anchor was reporting a developing story from the county prosecutor's office. It was Darla, or rather, it was the hospital. And then Darla's name slid across the screen like a blade. According to the news brief, multiple financial irregularities had been discovered in the discretionary grant programs tied to hospital outreach. An internal whistleblower had provided full digital trails, wire transfer receipts, and email communications. Among the flagged individuals were 2 mid-level administrators, 1 senior board member, and Darla Reynolds, head of fundraising and community outreach. Her photo was displayed beside the headline, "Investigation opens into fraudulent use of public health grants." By 8:15 a.m., the story had jumped to the state network. It didn't take long before it reached every screen in town. Phones rang, comments exploded online. Even the town's church newsletter released a statement by midday, declaring concern and a commitment to transparency and moral accountability in our civic leaders. That phrase made McKenna laugh out loud. By early afternoon, I had 3 voicemails from former acquaintances who hadn't called me in years. One of them was a woman named Patricia, who used to sit beside Darla at the Chamber of Commerce luncheons and once told me I dressed too plainly for a woman with so much land. Now she was asking if I had time for a quiet coffee. I deleted the message without listening to the end. But the real thunderclap came not from the news or social media. It came from the courtroom. Joseph Maddox had filed our civil suit against Darla and Marcus quietly the week before. The one centered on attempted fraud, property coercion, financial defamation, and emotional abuse of a vulnerable elder. We hadn't publicized it. We didn't need to. But the timing now, paired with the hospital's legal unraveling, painted a picture even their lawyer couldn't blur. The complaint itself was airtight. McKenna had organized it like a crime board, chronological, verified, attached with surveillance logs, time-stamped voicemails, and McKenna's recorded transcripts of Darla's threats, including the one from the kitchen when she crushed the wheels of my chair. It was all laid bare, and Joseph wasn't subtle in the language. The suit requested full restitution of attempted financial damages, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a restraining order from both parties. He filed it with the county clerk just before lunch. By the time dinner rolled around, the clerk's office had confirmed. The suit had been received and processed, and would be served within the next 72 hours. But fate works faster when a storm brews from both sides. That evening, the Board of Trustees at the hospital issued a suspension notice. Darla was placed on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Her corporate email was shut down. Her badge access was revoked. She was no longer allowed on hospital grounds. Marcus, meanwhile, had gone silent. No texts, no visits, not even a knock at the gate. But I knew he was watching. The silence was different now. It wasn't avoidance, it was calculation. He had gambled everything on Darla's charm, her ambition, and her ability to smooth over the cracks. But now those cracks had turned into canyons, and he had nothing to hold on to. The next morning, I received a letter. It was handwritten, no return address. But the penmanship was familiar. It was from Marcus. The words were uneven, scribbled, like he wrote them in the dark. He didn't apologize. He didn't even mention Darla by name. All he said was that he was surprised it got this far and never wanted it to turn into a war. I read it once. Then I placed it into the same file that McKenna had labeled Evidence, Phase 2. It wasn't a truce, it was a fear response. He saw what was coming and wanted to pretend he hadn't loaded the gun. But it was too late for pretending. By Friday, the story had reached regional news. My name wasn't mentioned, Not yet. But the outlines were there. The anonymous elder property owner, the alleged coercion attempt, the hidden inheritance placed into trust to avoid manipulation. They couldn't name me because we hadn't gone public, but the town could read between the lines. And now they were whispering for a different reason. They weren't questioning what I was hiding. They were wondering what else I might still reveal. And I had only just begun. That weekend, Joseph received a call from Darla's legal representation. They wanted to open dialogue about a possible settlement. They suggested mediation, a quiet resolution, no publicity, no court dates. Joseph declined the call. Then he emailed them the upcoming court dates and reminded them that the full complaint, all 87 pages, would become public record by Monday. We weren't asking for silence. We were demanding exposure. And just before I shut the lights off that night, McKenna brought in a final envelope. It had been delivered by courier. Inside was an unsigned letter from one of the hospital's donors, a woman I had met once, briefly, at a veterans fundraising gala years ago. She thanked me, said she had always suspected the money wasn't going where it was supposed to. She offered to testify if needed. I placed her note next to the others. The evidence pile wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the people they had stepped on, lied to, overlooked. This wasn't just about land or inheritance or even revenge. It was about history, the kind that gets buried, unless someone decides to dig it out. And I had all the tools I needed. Monday came with rain, a soft, grey drizzle that seemed to settle over the entire town like a heavy breath. The courthouse sat in the middle of the square, quiet from the outside, but humming on the inside. Reporters weren't allowed in yet, but that didn't stop them from circling outside with cameras tucked under plastic sleeves. McKenna drove us around back, where Joseph was waiting near the side entrance. He didn't speak much, just handed me the folder again, the same one we'd reviewed countless times. Inside were all the exhibits, all the receipts, all the screenshots, timestamps, emails. One photograph printed in large format that showed Darla leaving my house the night she screamed at me in the driveway. You could see the heel of her boot crushed against the gravel. Joseph walked slightly ahead of us through the hallway. Everything echoed. I rolled in silence, hands folded in my lap. My shoulders stayed back. My chin didn't tremble. In the courtroom, Marcus sat on the far side of the bench with his lawyer. He didn't turn to look. Darla was next to him. No makeup this time. Her hair was tied back, tight and flat. She wore a black blazer with gold buttons, though the sleeves were slightly too long. She looked thinner than usual, and for a flicker of a second, I wondered if she'd actually lost sleep. Then I saw the way her fingers kept tapping against her thigh, and I knew. She wasn't broken. She was planning. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The hearing wasn't long. 37 minutes by the clock. Joseph was precise. He introduced the complaint, walked through the dates, the documents, the correspondence. He pointed to the timeline projected behind him and explained, piece by piece, how the coercion began with financial dependency, grew into verbal threats, and culminated in the attempted forced transfer of property while I was still in medical recovery. Then he played the audio, that clip, the one from my kitchen. Darla's voice, sharp, cold, slashing, poured out into the room. The words were unmistakable, the threat, the mockery, the way she said I was lucky to still have a bed, that if I didn't cooperate, she'd find a way to put me in a home with plastic spoons and locked bathrooms. I didn't look at her while it played. I looked straight ahead. And when it ended, there was no sound at all, no cough, no whisper, not even a shift in the seats. The judge asked if the defendants had a response. Darla's lawyer stood and requested a motion to postpone formal rebuttal, cited ongoing investigations, mentioned emerging evidence. But he couldn't deny the recording. He didn't even try to explain it. He simply said, "We will reserve response for trial." The judge nodded, set the date, court adjourned. But the real moment didn't happen in front of the bench. It happened in the hallway, 22 minutes later, beside the vending machine near the clerk's office. Darla approached me. No cameras, no lawyers, just her. She stood a little too close. I didn't flinch. She said my name like it tasted like vinegar, asked me if this was really how I wanted things to end, said she still had connections, said I could pull the suit and walk away with dignity. I stayed quiet. She stepped back, glanced around, then lowered her voice. She said Marcus was breaking, that he hadn't spoken to her in days, that he was unraveling faster than she could control. Then she made a mistake. She said, "I hope you're proud of what you're doing to your son." Not what we had done to him, what I was doing. Like I had planted this chaos in his life, instead of reacting to the fire they lit under mine. McKenna was nearby. She started walking over, but I raised one hand, just barely, enough to keep her from interrupting. Then I turned to Darla, calmly, and I told her the truth, that I wasn't proud. I was finished. That pride wasn't part of this anymore. Neither was shame. I told her what mattered now was clarity. What mattered was making sure that when someone stepped on the neck of a person they thought was too weak to fight back, they would think twice before doing it again. Darla didn't reply. She just stared, then muttered something under her breath and walked off, her heels clicking unevenly down the tile hallway. The echo followed her all the way out. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders. No TV, no news, just quiet. McKenna brought out 2 cups of tea. We didn't talk, but I knew she felt it too. The shift. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving. I was standing, not because they let me, but because I built something stronger than what they tried to take. And the trial hadn't even begun. Because this wasn't the end. This was the center, the eye of the storm, and everything that came next would be louder, harder, more public. But I was ready. My name was no longer a name they could use. It was a warning. And I was just getting started. The invitation arrived 4 days after the court hearing. A thick envelope, cream-colored, the kind people use for weddings or baby showers. It was hand-delivered to my door by a courier who barely met my eye. Inside, there was no letterhead, no formal signature, just a simple card, written in Marcus's handwriting. Dinner at the house. Thursday. Just us. For a moment, I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that barely passed my throat. Then I stared at the card again. He didn't mention Darla. He didn't mention anything about the lawsuit or the press that had started circling around their side of town like buzzards. Just a note. Just a time. I called McKenna. She said she'd wait in the car outside. Just in case. I wore dark slacks, my deep green cardigan, and a scarf that had once belonged to my mother. The one she used to wear to church on Sundays, before the arthritis made buttons hard. I took nothing else with me. No bag, no documents, just myself. When I arrived, the porch lights were on. The house looked the same, except the curtains had changed. New fabric, a paler shade of beige. Darla's taste, undoubtedly. It made the space look like it was trying too hard to be something it wasn't. Marcus opened the door. He looked smaller, not physically, but something in his stance had shrunk. His shoulders didn't roll forward the way they used to when he hugged me. His eyes were tired, not red, just flat. He motioned me in, didn't say much. We sat in the dining room. The table was set for 2. No silver domes, no candles, just a plate of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Comfort food, food he used to ask me to make when he was sick as a child. He didn't touch his plate, For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he began. His voice was low, not apologetic, not warm, just hollow. He said he never expected it to go this far, that he didn't know Darla had recorded that threat, or that she had planned the fake transfer with the forged notary. He said the lawyer had been hired by her, not him, that he had signed things without reading because she told him it was standard. I let him speak. I let the excuses fall around me like leaves. Dry, harmless, meaningless. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. A settlement offer. His lawyer had drafted it that morning. In exchange for dropping the lawsuit and signing over the lot next to the main house, the one they had illegally annexed, he was offering me $850,000 and a signed letter of reconciliation, a public one, which would be posted in the local paper. He said it would help clean things up. I didn't touch the paper. I looked at the wine glass in front of me. It was water, not wine. Probably McKenna's doing. She had told me once she didn't trust them enough to let me eat alone without some kind of backup plan. I pushed the glass to the side, and I asked him, with no tone in my voice, if he remembered the summer of his 8th birthday. The one where I took on a 3rd shift at the ER just to pay for his summer camp. The one where he broke his wrist climbing that old pine and cried for 3 days because he thought he'd ruined the whole trip. He didn't respond, so I told him I remembered. I remembered how tightly he had clung to me when I picked him up, how he buried his face in my shoulder and said he never wanted to leave my side again. I remembered that boy, and I told him he wasn't here anymore. The man sitting across from me was a stranger, one who had watched his wife call me names, threaten me, isolate me, steal from me, and said nothing. Then I stood up. I left the settlement on the table, walked out of that house with no goodbye, no handshake, no backward glance. In the car, McKenna didn't ask what happened. She just drove. The next morning, Joseph called me. He said Marcus had made an offer to the judge through a private channel, that he was trying to negotiate partial immunity in exchange for testifying against Darla. But it was too late. The recordings were in. The forged documents were verified. The notary, bless her brave soul, had agreed to testify on my behalf, confirming that her name and signature had been falsified. The case was moving forward. And the moment that dinner ended, something shifted. Not just in Marcus, in me. I had stepped back into that house prepared to consider peace. Not forgiveness, not trust, but peace. What I found instead was a man still trying to solve betrayal with silence, still thinking money could undo a violation of blood, and for that he would have to face not just the law, but the truth. In the weeks ahead, the depositions would start. The press would circle tighter. The bank accounts would freeze. Darla would realize the storm she'd unleashed had no roof. And Marcus, my only child, would come to terms with what it meant to burn the bridge to your own mother. Because I was no longer the woman who cooked the chicken and folded the shirts and stayed silent when cursed at. I was the woman who remembered, the woman who rebuilt. And I was done explaining myself to people who treated me like a mistake. There would be no more dinners, only consequences. The news broke before noon. By the time I finished my coffee, Darla's face was already on 2 local news sites and a city gossip blog that McKenna forwarded to me without comment. There she was, caught mid-stride on a courthouse staircase, flanked by her attorney and someone from PR, trying to block the cameras with a rolled-up folder. It didn't work. Her scowl spread across 3 counties before the hour was up. The headline was simple: Local realtor accused of elder fraud and document forgery. It had taken less than 3 weeks since the dinner for the case to fully ignite. Not because I wanted to humiliate them, not because I sought public vengeance, but because silence was no longer an option. The notary's statement had gone public. Her video testimony, done privately with my legal team, had been submitted as evidence and accidentally leaked. Not by me, but I didn't cry about it either. Darla's brokerage firm issued a statement distancing themselves. Within 48 hours, her license was temporarily suspended pending investigation. Her name disappeared from all listings. A few of her clients left comments online about being shocked and disappointed. One man claimed she had rushed him into a condo purchase that he now believed was overpriced. The cracks were growing. Marcus, meanwhile, was still hiding. He hadn't shown up to his scheduled deposition. His lawyer sent an excuse that he was undergoing medical evaluation for stress and emotional trauma related to the ongoing legal dispute. I laughed when I read it. Trauma. That word felt like gravel in my teeth. I wondered if he thought about the night Darla screamed at me in front of the grandkids and pushed my shoulder hard enough I had to steady myself on the edge of the kitchen counter. I wondered if that registered as trauma for him, or just another Thursday. No one came to see me at the house, which was fine. I didn't want visitors. I wanted results. And they came quickly. The judge ruled that the evidence against Darla was strong enough to proceed with a full hearing. No plea deal, no mediation. The charges included fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and trespassing, the latter related to the secondary property that she had illegally accessed and tried to stage as her own. The property transfer forms, the ones they tried to push through under a notary's name, were invalidated. The land reverted to me. It took 3 signed orders and a sheriff's visit for her to leave the guest house. McKenna sent me a picture. Darla stood outside the house, arms crossed, waiting for her Uber with 3 suitcases and a duffel bag that looked like it had been packed in fury. The kids weren't with her. They had already been picked up by Marcus's sister, my niece Jenna, who had quietly offered to help without saying much. I never asked Jenna to get involved. She did anyway. Somewhere deep down, I think she wanted to make it right. For the way she had distanced herself years ago, afraid of being caught between me and the son I raised. Family politics run in the blood. But this time, she stood by me. It meant something. Meanwhile, my lawyer had begun the second phase. He called it the leverage round. We weren't just pushing for damages anymore. We were opening up financial records, not just mine, but theirs. Bank accounts, credit cards, mortgage applications, investment portfolios, the kind of digging that makes powerful people sweat. And they did. Turns out, Darla had been using funds from the brokerage's discretionary client accounts to make personal payments. She bought 2 high-end bags and a diamond tennis bracelet under a client's name. The accounting firm that audited her office froze the accounts and sent a separate notice to state licensing. That bracelet showed up in one of her vacation photos. From Maui, the same trip they took when they told me they were too busy to celebrate Thanksgiving. Marcus still hadn't responded publicly, but someone from his college alumni board called to ask whether I was okay. Apparently, someone had filed a character complaint against him too. His employer hadn't issued any statement yet, but the board member said he might be asked to take leave if things got worse. Things were already worse. They just didn't know how deep the roots went. See, this wasn't just about Darla forging my name and trying to steal land. It wasn't just about being shoved out of my home or having my name erased from the family trust they tried to rewrite behind my back. It was about legacy, mine. I had spent years building a quiet, steady foundation, working shifts, saving pennies, planting trees that outlived my marriage. I had done it all with the belief that one day my son would carry it forward, honor it. Instead, he tried to bury me beneath it, literally and legally. But I wasn't going to die in silence. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, not in any way. And now, the very system they tried to weaponize was turning its sights in them. I received a subpoena request asking if I'd be willing to testify in person. The court had already accepted my affidavits and video evidence, but the DA said my presence would strengthen the case. She wanted the jury to hear my voice, see my face. I said yes, not because I needed revenge, but because I needed them to see what strength looks like. Not loud, not bitter, just steady, the kind that outlives lies. I sat at the kitchen table that night, lights off, letting the day settle into the walls. The breeze through the trees hummed low, almost like a lullaby. I thought about everything that had been taken from me: time, trust, love that once felt eternal and ended up conditional. But I also thought about what had returned: my name, my land, my spine. And I knew deep in my bones that this fight wasn't just about one family, one betrayal. It was about every woman who had ever been told she was overreacting, every mother whose sacrifices had been rewritten as debts. This chapter would not end with whispers. It would end with the sound of truth. And I was ready to speak. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The walls didn't echo, but the silence felt heavy, like every unspoken betrayal had settled into the chairs, the floorboards, the breath of people waiting to hear what no one wanted to admit out loud. I walked in with my lawyer, knees stiff but steady, spine upright. No one offered me a smile, not even the clerk. But that was all right. I wasn't here to be comforted. I was here to be heard. Marcus sat on the far left, behind his lawyer. His eyes darted to me once, then back to his lap. He looked thinner than I remembered. Not sick, just diminished. I used to know that boy. Now I only recognized the suit. Darla wasn't there. Her seat remained empty until 5 minutes before the session began. She swept in with her defense attorney and a woman who looked like a crisis manager. Hair too perfect, face too calm. She whispered something to Darla, who gave a clipped nod, then sat stiffly. Our eyes met once. She blinked first. The judge entered. The court officer called the docket, and suddenly, everything that had unraveled behind closed doors became public. The prosecutor stood and laid out the foundation. A timeline of events, evidence already admitted, forensic reports, video footage, witness testimony. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, steady, undeniable. Then came my turn. They called me to the stand. I had never testified before. I'd seen it in movies, imagined it late at night, rehearsed it in my head more times than I could count. But nothing prepares you for the weight of truth when spoken in front of strangers. I took the oath. I sat down. And I told the truth. I told them how Darla had maneuvered her way into my financial records, how she'd intercepted legal mail, how Marcus signed forms without reading them, how I was pressured, cornered, manipulated, not with weapons, but with guilt and silence. I told them about the night I was asked to sign papers under duress, about the push, about the fear, about how my own voice felt small in a home I had built. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I let the words do the work. The courtroom didn't stir. No gasps, no murmurs, just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when people realize they've been blind to a quiet war happening inside someone they thought they understood. Then the defense began their questions. They tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, that I had approved certain decisions, that Darla was simply managing what Marcus couldn't handle, that I had grown forgetful, that perhaps I had given mixed signals. I didn't flinch. I repeated the facts. My memory was clear. The lawyer paused, then asked about a specific bank transfer, one Darla had made into a joint account weeks before the trust was amended. My lawyer objected. The judge allowed it. So I explained. The money had been withdrawn without my consent. The signature on the request form wasn't mine. We had already submitted the handwriting analysis. Darla's initials were traced. The timestamp on the surveillance footage showed her inside the credit union that morning. Not me. There was nothing left to argue. When I stepped down, I didn't look at Marcus. I didn't need to. He hadn't said a word the entire morning. Not when the court played the audio clip of Darla discussing the elder proof loophole. Not when they displayed the forged grant deed. Not even when the notary took the stand and admitted under oath that she had been pressured to look the other way. The silence from my son was more painful than anything else in that room. Not the lies, not the greed, just the absence of remorse. The court recessed for lunch. I sat outside on a bench, facing the parking lot. Wind moved through the trees. Distant traffic hummed like white noise. I wasn't hungry. I was tired, but not broken. I stared at a hawk circling high overhead and thought about how long it took for something to rise again after a storm. Marcus came out alone. No tie, jacket draped over one shoulder. He walked slowly, then stopped 3 feet from me. His voice was low. He said he didn't know how things had gone this far, that he never meant for it to turn into this, that Darla had been the one pushing, that he had lost control. I listened. Not because I believed him, but because I needed to hear what cowardice sounded like. Then he said something that chilled me. He asked if I would consider withdrawing the charges if Darla stepped away voluntarily. He said the media had already done enough damage, that the kids were getting teased at school, that he had already lost too much. I didn't speak right away. Then I stood, looked him in the eye, and I said, "You didn't lose me in court. You lost me the moment you stood by while your wife erased me from your life. The damage you speak of isn't collateral. It's consequence." Then I walked away. I didn't turn back. He didn't follow. Inside, court resumed. The final evidence was submitted. The judge confirmed the dates for sentencing and civil restitution. The last piece of property, the cabin they tried to flip, was legally frozen and marked as under investigation for fraudulent deed transfer. I left the building with nothing in my hands, but everything in place. The law had spoken, but more importantly, so had I. And that changed everything. The hearing was over, the courtroom had emptied out, but inside me, the dust had only begun to settle. I went back home that same afternoon. Not the house Marcus tried to steal, not the estate in my name they thought was theirs. I mean home in the truest sense. The little cottage in Westbury, the one with the old creaking porch and the rosemary that grew wild near the fence. The only place I'd never let anyone else touch. I made tea, just 1 cup. I sat in the kitchen with the back door open, letting the breeze come in. My hands were tired, but they didn't shake anymore. For the first time in months, I didn't lock the door behind me. Later that week, the news broke publicly. Not just the court ruling, but the part that Darla's lawyer had begged to keep sealed. The notarized confession of the financial abuse, the manipulation, the evidence of collusion between her and 2 real estate brokers across the county line. Marcus's name wasn't scrubbed either. People talked. They whispered at grocery stores. They forwarded the article in neighborhood Facebook groups. They posted old photos of me at the county garden club and wrote things like, "We always knew she was tough as nails." But I didn't need their opinions. I had already made my peace. What mattered more was what I did next. I didn't want the land back just to keep it. I wanted it to mean something beyond my name printed on deeds, so I met with a small group of women, most of them older, some widowed, some long divorced, some quietly raising grandchildren on their own. They had come to the library one Thursday morning for a lecture on resilience, not knowing I was the speaker. When I stepped up and introduced myself, a hush fell over the room. I told them what had happened. Not every legal detail, but the truth. The betrayal. The pressure. The moment I realized I had to protect myself, even from my own blood. and how, despite everything, I still believed in starting again. Then I told them about the land, 80 acres, mostly wooded, with a small stream and a few buildings too run down to save. But it wasn't what it had. It was what it could become. A space for women like us. A place to stay when they needed to leave. A greenhouse to grow more than just herbs. A kitchen to teach skills, pass down recipes, share silence and stories and survival. A legal clinic once a month, sponsored by the trust I had reactivated under my full control. The non-profit paperwork was already filed, the board already named. We called it the Second Garden. Marcus never reached out again. Darla filed for bankruptcy and moved out of state. Their children, my grandchildren, remained distant. Not cruel, but hesitant. I had sent birthday cards. I kept their photos on the hallway shelf. I knew what time and truth would either mend or break completely, but I was no longer holding my breath for an apology. Sometimes healing doesn't come from who hurt you. It comes from what you choose to do with the scars. The second garden opened quietly on a Wednesday. No ribbon cutting, no press, no forced smiles. Just tea, sunlight, and the hands of 12 women planting the first line of lavender. I didn't wear black that day. I wore green, and I smiled. Not for show, not to prove a point, just because the wind smelled of rosemary, and because, for once, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. If you're still listening, thank you. Some stories are heavier than others, but if mine reminded you of something you've survived, or someone you had to walk away from, just know this. Your peace is not a betrayal. Your silence is not weakness. And your strength is not too late. If this story moved you in any way, feel free to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're ready, tell me, what is the second garden you've planted for yourself?